Ben said, I am from Butterfly Pavilion. I'm the community habitats manager, which seems like a very nebulous title, but I get to basically work in the community developing habitat for specifically invertebrates. And I absolutely love it. I get to engage with all kinds of different people, be immersed in nature every day, and I'm super grateful for that. Um, and I also just want to quickly share, if you could bear with me, this is my first virtual seminar where I can't see another human being, and I'm used to engaging directly. So I hope we're all able to connect in some way through this presentation tonight. Um, a bit of an agenda. I do want to start off with just a quick story about my personal garden. I do want to provide some foundational information about pollinators, what they are, what they need. I know some of you are probably already super familiar with that, but it's always great to, rehash that foundational base of information before we add on to it, right? Then I want to zoom out a little bit, look at what the heck is the importance of these pollinators to begin with, broadly for planetary health, and then we'll get into why you guys are here, right? What's going on in fall and winter with our pollinators, with our little creatures, and what can we do in our gardens to actually support them. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to talk about some extended learning opportunities and options for you guys to continue learning and doing this kind of work in your own lives and in your own communities. So my journey with nature and with wildlife and with gardening started when I was really, really little. We don't need to get into my entire life story, but I figure we can start with my first home, where I actually input a garden in a box to begin my garden. I think this was in 2011, maybe 2012. But I moved into my first home. It was pretty sterile. It was primarily turf grass, no HOA, so a lot of the turf grass was just dead turf grass. I funneled tons of money into my sprinklers and moving my two hoses around my yard, and really wasn't engaged with my space other than putting a bunch of water on it, right? And during the same time, I'm spending a lot of time hiking, exploring Colorado, exploring other spaces and seeing awesome little creatures moving around, seeing beautiful flowers, seeing beautiful systems that are completely disconnected from my neighborhood, from my world. And then also at the same time, seeing that my neighbors are loud and wild and colorful personalities, and seeing that our neighborhood was not representative of that in absolutely any way. It would seem sterile, it would seem sad. And so I really, really wanted to change this and started by putting in a little garden in a box garden. I will say I didn't do much with it for the first few years. It kind of didn't get any love. But then I met my then boyfriend, now husband. We started doing a lot of nerdy wildlife adventures together, something that he was super unfamiliar with. But then I looped him on board, to, how can we change our own landscape? How can we bring this sense of space that we love to go out to into our own homes, right? And into our own neighborhood. So we were on a mission to combat this conformity, to get rid of the sterility in our neighborhood, at least in our own little space, right? And to really hang out with bugs, because I've always been a total bug nerd. But what ended up actually happening, I became the neighborhood witch, which in some ways I am very proud of that title. No one's ever told me that, but that's just kind of how I feel I am. But my yard was just wild, woolly, a little bit out of control. And subsequently from that, for a few years, pretty much every season, I ended up with some type of city code violation, whether it was noxious weed presence, it was grass height, it was something going on. But during that whole time, I was working really hard to bring nature into my own garden, and bring native species in and bring this sense of nature and wild into my own space. But this is just kind of, I guess, a PSA for everyone who's in the process of converting maybe a turf lawn into a native habitat. It's not a quick and easy process. It's not a clean process. And that's totally fine. You know, I kind of see these city code violations as a few badges of honor in a way. But I am happy to say I haven't had any violations in a few years now, because I think people are starting to get what I'm actually trying to do. But anyway, our own gardens can serve a variety of purposes. And what's great is we can make them exactly how we want, within reason if we have an HOA, right? But we can really design them, we can build them and feed them to serve the needs of pollinators and to serve as a snapshot of our Colorado spaces too. So right now, these are a few things that we can find in my garden. It's bustling, there's lots of bees, there's butterflies, I find beetles, all kinds of different things on a daily basis. And I love tracking them. And today we'll talk a little bit about some opportunities and ways that we can track our own spaces to understand really what we're looking at. But anyway, it's morphed a lot, but I am still the neighborhood witch and I'm okay with that. So a quote by a wonderful naturalist and author that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, E.O. Wilson, that really kind of fits what we're trying to do with our native spaces, right? And serving pollinators. Humanity is exalted, not because we are so far above other living creatures, but because knowing them well elevates the very concept of life. And I feel that every day in my garden when I get to go out and see bugs and birds and a new weird creature that I hadn't seen before. And that's kind of what today is all about. A quote from another person I really enjoy, Ron Finley. They call him the gangsta gardener. If you guys have not heard of him or seen a video by him, he's pretty incredible. But this quote really resonates with me. Gardening is the most therapeutic and defiant act that you can do, plus you get strawberries. So we may not be talking about fruit necessarily, but we get butterflies, we get beetles, we get adorable little bee flies, right? And in our current political climate, in our current scenario, gardening, creating native habitat, supporting the little creatures that people tend to not care about is very defiant, and it is very empowering, and you should keep doing it, keep at it, and also look up the gangster gardener. All right. Bear with me with my tech. There we go. So I'm going to have you all engage with me so I know that there's people there. If you could pull out your smartphone, some kind of device, and scan this QR code, I'm going to have us all pick our own pollinator muse, or pick a pollinator that resonates with you the most, whether it's reflective of your own personality, a personality you want to have, things you value, whatever works. But go ahead and scan that code. And I know the image is going to be quite small, so I've also enlarged it here for us along with that QR code. So I'm going to give everyone, let's do about like 30 seconds here and see who you identify with most, or who are you inspired by the most. And these little creatures are going to be along for the ride with us until 8 o'clock tonight. So just take a few seconds. All right. So this next slide should show me, and hopefully at least a couple of you guys have participated here. Oh, looks like the monarch butterfly is our #1 pick, and that makes complete sense. And second, we've got our green sweat bee. We only have one selection for blister beetle. I guess that makes sense, but we'll talk a little bit more about blister beetles and their overwintering behaviors in a little bit, and maybe you'll identify a little bit more. Personally, I'm going to pick our oblique longhorn bee. That's how I'm feeling today anyway. All right, cool. Thanks for participating, guys. And keep in mind who your pollinator muse is, so you can get a little bit more well acquainted with them as we move along today. Okay, so let's talk about who are pollinators? What makes a pollinator, right? Because I think there's the perception that anything that moves is or has the capacity to be a pollinator. And I suppose that is true, that anything has the capacity to pollinate. But there are a few characteristics that really qualify as efficient, as useful for allowing something to be called a pollinator. So let's take a look at some of those characteristics, right? So we're looking at things that have the right parts, the right characteristics, whether it's behavior, it's a morphological feature that allows them to effectively transfer pollen between like species, right? We're trying to accomplish sexual fertilization with our pollination, right? We're trying to create a new plant with some new genetics, right? So we're not just getting clones of the same thing. And we'll talk about why that's important in a second as well. So our pollinators have a general set of characteristics, right? One is being hair. We can see on this bumblebee all the white granules from that flower being deposited all over the bumblebee's body, on the legs, on the abdomen, on the back, a little bit on the forehead there. Majority of pollinators that you see are going to have some type of hair-like structure that allows them to effectively gather that pollen when they're visiting a plant. Another feature is specialized eyesight. So a lot of our plant materials have what are called nectar guides, or sometimes they look like targets, sometimes they look like lines, like arrows, but they react specifically with the eyesight of pollinators that typically are seeing on the UV and the UVA spectrum. So they're seeing things completely differently. They may fly over a aster that we may see as completely yellow, but from their specialized eyes, they're seeing this bright red target circled right around where the nectar is in that plant. So those specialized eyes allow them to interact with plants in a way that allows them to effectively pollinate, right? Another feature that a lot of our pollinators have are specific olfactory senses. So a lot of our insect pollinators have essentially a sense of smell on their antennae. And this allows them to interact with plants in a very specialized way as well. So they're attracted to different plant compounds that interact with those olfactory senses that they have. Another feature, specialized mouth parts. So you can see this bee fly here, for those of you who picked bee fly, this super long tongue sticking out that allows them to effectively access the nectar down inside those floral components. If you think about something like a butterfly or a moth, they have those long proboscis tongues too, right? We have some shorter tongue bees, long tongue bees. All of our pollinators have some type of mouth morphological structure that allows them to interact with the plants that they're visiting in a very specialized way. Next, we have just the right size. So we have some pollinators that are incredibly small that can fit their entire body in incredibly small floral parts. Contrasting, we have some bumblebees that weigh so much that they land on the lip of a flower and they open it up and they can access things that maybe another pollinator wouldn't be able to access. So this associated size with our pollinators and the plants that they are effectively pollinating, right? And then flight is another huge one. So if we have something that isn't able to move quickly, isn't able to cover a lot of ground, the likelihood of it being able to transfer pollen from one plant to another plant is diminished, right? So something that can fly and can move around and can bounce across a number of different flowers is going to be an effective pollinator. So that flight is a huge feature of our pollinating creatures, right? And then next we have this bit of floral attraction. So all of our pollinators are visiting our flowers for a particular reason, and it's generally to get some type of resource. And we'll talk a little bit more about those resources. But a pollinator is a pollinator because it is intentionally visiting a plant for a particular reason, right? Something that casually goes across a plant is not likely to then intentionally visit another plant of that same species. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. But an animal having an intentional attraction to a flower is really what makes it an effective pollinator. So we can unpack that a little bit later. So I am from Butterfly Pavilion, so logically I'm going to be talking primarily about insect pollinators, but also the reason I'm doing that is because they are the largest percentage by far of pollinating creatures. We do have some others, but our insect pollinators make up the large majority, especially here in Colorado. So within our insects, there are 4 orders that tend to be the most effective pollinators. So we have perhaps the first one people think of, we have our butterflies and our moths, our lepidopterans. We have our hymenopterans, our bees and our wasps. We have our coleopterans, our beetles, and we have our flies as well. So don't forget that flies need a lot of love also. As beautiful as bees and butterflies are, our flies are pretty incredible, and also are our beetles. So we have a few species of note here: our woolly bee fly, police car moth, American bumblebee, which is a species of concern currently in Colorado, and our flower beetle. And you can see each of them either is covered in pollen or has the capacity to be covered in pollen, right? And then to move that to another plant. And a few other examples of our 4 orders species within, we have a drone fly on the left, which I think is actually very beautiful. I have a clearwing moth. These fall under a category that some people call hummingbird moths because they're often confused with little birds as they're flitting around. We have a longhorn bee in our hymenopterans, and then we have a blister beetle. So these are some common species that you may see that fall under our pollinating insects. And then, of course, we have our non-insects, right? Arguably, we have our little ground mammals like our field mice, our deer mice. They do have the potential to pollinate, but however, our little field mice are small moving mammals, are not intentionally visiting flowers for any reason. They are not eating nectar. They are not eating pollen. They're usually eating leaves. They're eating insects on the plants. They're not intentionally inside the flower moving around for any particular reason. And so for that reason, at least here in Colorado, and the small mammals that we have, they are not considered horribly effective pollinators. So we're not filling them into that category. But next, we have our bats on the left. I absolutely love bats. Bats are so rad. But again, here in Colorado, we have a specific set of bats that are not visiting flowers necessarily intentionally, right? So there are some bats in the tropics, in desert biomes and desert ecosystems that are nectivores. So they're there to eat nectar, and they're visiting those flowers that bloom late at night, right? When they're also out. However, here in Colorado, we don't have really many species that bloom at night, and the bat species that we have are insectivores. So they're eating insects. They're not really inside a flower for any other reason than to maybe eat an insect. So the likelihood of them moving pollen from one plant of one species to another plant of the same species is pretty darn low, actually. But in other parts of the world, bats are super duper effective pollinators. And then last, we have our ruby throat hummingbird on the bottom. We do have a number of different Colorado hummingbird species that are effective pollinators. We're not including them too much in the conversation today because in the winter, they tend to migrate, right? We're not really seeing them in winter. And so as far as resource provision, it's not going to be anything other than what we're giving them in the summer, right? Because they're not going to be around. So yes, they are effective pollinators. They're amazing. They're beautiful. But we're not going to be mentioning them too much in this conversation. All right. So let's do just a quick little review of pollinator needs. And I also want to mention I'm going to be having a few little breaks throughout this that will help us feel like we're immersed in a garden or out in nature, seeing pollinators. I personally am used to teaching and learning outdoors and face to face with people where we can connect and we can immerse ourselves and feel what we're learning about. So hopefully those quick little breaks will help in between my talking at myself on this screen. Okay, so here's a little bit of a review of pollinator needs, even though I'm sure most of you are super familiar, right? So of course we have our food for our adults, and this comes in the form of nectar, of pollen. They're using this for day-to-day nutrition, day-to-day energy. They're getting their sugars, they're getting their starches, their proteins from flowers as adults, right? That's what we typically see them doing when we see them out in our gardens. They're foraging, they're getting down inside those flowers and they're feeding themselves as adults. But something to also think about is food for babies, right? And the best example of that is this idea of host plants. The most obvious host plant that I can share with someone is the milkweed for our monarch babies, right? You can see in this photo, we have a tiny little monarch baby feeding on a big milkweed leaf. And these are those plants that have the chemical compounds that are just cued with the adults, right? So mama monarch recognizes the chemical compounds. Mama monarch recognizes the milkweed as the plant to lay her eggs on, right? And oftentimes these host plants have different compounds within them for baby to eat and ingest that then make them toxic to predators, that make birds not want to eat them, that make other predators not want to mess with them. And this happens in a variety of species. With their different host plant associations. So food is super important. Outside of the host plants, we also have our growing bees, we have our growing flies, and there's different materials that the adults get from plants to then give to their babies. And we'll look at some examples of that in a moment too. Next, we have breeding resources. We'll examine this some more in a couple of slides too, but things that facilitate our pollinators breeding with one another and then facilitate them being able to lay eggs, have children, take care of those children. Without those resources, not a lot is going to happen in our garden, right? Another piece is shelter and structure. Again, we're really going to talk a lot about this because of fall and winter, but having places for roosting and reprieve, safety from the weather, safety from the elements, right? Another feature is diversity in the landscape, whether that's plant species diversity or height diversity, structural diversity, grasses, shrubs, forbs, a variety of different plant types, right? And then diversity in the seasonality too. Do we have resources available spring, summer, fall, and then ideally winter too for overwintering babies? And then maybe a last thing to think about is connectivity between all of these things. It's great to provide one thing that can serve a pollinator. It's another to then provide multiple things where it can move throughout the landscape, where it can move into an adjacent landscape, where it has an availability of resources to continue to move and to breed with different populations, right? And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that later as well. But let's go ahead and take a quick little pollinator pause and take a look at this adorable little leaf cutter bee flitting about. Let's play it again. Getting its belly all covered in pollen. And there wasn't supposed to be sound on that, so it should have been a little bit more enjoyable than that. But just seeing things like that makes me so excited about the fact that we have so many people joining this webinar just to learn how to protect them, right? It's pretty exciting stuff. Okay, so let's take a step back just a second and talk a little bit about, why Why pollinators? Why pollination? Who the heck cares, right? Well, from my perspective, the biggest thing is that they're really foundational to the health and the success of our ecosystems as a whole, and then subsequently our entire planet, right? So pollination and this idea of introducing varied genetics into populations really is the driver of biodiversity at large, right? So we see the diversity in genetics at that population level. We see it move into species. We see it move into the broader ecosystem. And so arguably pollination really is a main driver of biodiversity. So let's look at that just a little bit deeper. There we go. So biodiversity at that genetic level, right? We're looking at an individual species that has not just one phenotype, right? Here we can see we have light pink, we have darker pink, we have white, we have some flowers that are maybe a little bit larger, a longer stem. This is all one species of allium. And the way that this is able to happen in nature is because of pollinators, is because of pollination, right? Moving pollen from one plant to another, creating a new plant with entirely new genetic material. It allows for this diversity within a singular species and allows for this singular species to be resilient and to be successful. Let's say there's a pathogen that only attacks white petals of flowers, right? That fortunately is not a real thing, at least that I know of. But let's say that was introduced to a population of only the genetic expression of the flower on the right. All of those flowers would be affected by that pathogen, right? But in a community where there's this genetic diversity within the species can survive because these light pink, these darker pinks are going to be resistant to that white petal loving pathogen, right? So this is just at the individual species level, but then this does move up into different species, right? Over time, our pollinators facilitate the introduction of new species, right? There's hybridization taking place. There's continual combination of genetic material taking place that over time can create these new species and drives diversity as a whole. And that directly then feeds into our ecosystem diversity, right? We know that our plants are at basically the base level, the foundation of all of our systems. And without diversity in those plants, we won't have diversity in birds. We won't have diversity in large mammals. We won't have diversity in anything else that's higher up on the food chain, right? And things would just look entirely different. So pollination is arguably a main driver of the biodiversity of our planet. And that's pretty damn important if you ask me. Next, something to really think about as well. Oh no, one of my photos didn't show up. Pollination is responsible for a large percentage of our food production. It's responsible for the livelihood of plants that create some of our medicines, important fibers, beautiful plants with incredible cultural histories and rich associations with humans. So another reason to care about pollination is just specifically what it does for us every now and again, right? And it's huge stuff. We would lose a lot of food, we would lose a lot of medicine, important things that we utilize in our day-to-day life. So pollination, who cares? We cares. I stumbled across these photos as part of a photo essay I was hoping was attached to some beautiful poetry or really great perspective by an artist. I did find out that these photos were just generated by a resort company in the UK to get people to come visit their resorts more often. However, the photos do still paint a really interesting picture about the world without bees is what they're calling this series. In all reality, our world could totally look like this if we lose pollinators, right? The large percentage of plants that require biotic pollination it's massive, and our whole landscape could look completely differently. So us promoting and providing for these little guys in our own gardens may seem small, but by connecting to other spaces, connecting with natural areas, parks, broader systems that are also healthy, we're totally contributing to the slides on the right not happening, right? But kudos to this resort company for the creative approach to get people to visit. I appreciated it. Okay. I apologize for the sound still being on the videos, but pollinators really are just one part of the picture. And this is just going to be one quick little note. Pollination is what we're here for. However, if we're really looking to support ecosystem health, if we're really looking to support the broader health of our planet, pollinators are one little piece, right? So in this little video, we see a number of different ecological role players, right? Let me play it again. We have our jumping spider moving from the milkweed to the sage. We have our milkweed longhorn beetle. We have aphids. We have lacewing eggs. We have a little lady beetle larva. So in this one little ecosystem on one little milkweed plant, we have pollinators, we have herbivores, we have predators, we have pests, and all of these things are working in tandem together to support the health of the garden, right? So I just want to quickly cover that we should all be promoting all of these roles within our systems, as much as we do tend to only focus on pollinators, right? So we have our pollinators, we have our producer role, which is our plants. A lot of us are already focusing on that, so that's great. But also ensuring that we're encouraging predators to be in our space, right? Are we having our lady beetles? Are they around? Do we have mantids to take care of our pesty populations? Are we encouraging the lives of spiders too? And this isn't to say that we need to be actively bringing them into our space, but we want to actively not be killing these things, right? It's all about supporting this in this system in its entirety, and in turn, having a healthy system that's going to promote our pollinators. So we also, of course, have our herbivores, our detritivores helping us with our soils and nutrient cycling. We have our soil engineers that move water about, move nutrients about, air about, and then we have our pests that serve as prey for the rest of the system, right? So just something to think about. We love our pollinators. We want to support our pollinators, but also support all of these other eco roles too, right? It's only going to serve everything else. Okay, so I'm going to see if people are still alive out there because I have no idea. If you could pull out your phones again. And as we're thinking about the different pieces and parts that our pollinators need in our gardens, what things do you think that they're actually going to need as the season comes to a close? What comes to mind that we're going to have to do for them? So on this QR code, you'll have a opportunity to list, I think, 3 or 4 different ideas, and then it's going to all amalgamate to a word cloud. And then we'll see if we're on the right track for what some of the things we think our pollinators need this fall and this winter. And I'll give us about half a minute, and I will drink some tea. All right, let's see what we come up with. And feel free, even after we're done with these slides, feel free to keep adding things in. These lists will exist in perpetuity, as will your choice of your pollinator muse. If you're feeling like one day you just want to pick another one, go for it. It exists in a database somewhere. So, all right, let's see what you guys think. We've got protection, great. Cover, warmth, Places to put eggs. Love it. Last minute food. Totally. Diversity, hibernation, hibernating places. Spot to stash baby's larva. Oh, yes. You guys are all on the right track. Safe nesting sites, a place to tuck in, energy to store, undisturbed hideouts. Yes, you guys are all totally on the right track. Although I am curious about the chicken protector. If someone wants to put in the chat what that means, I don't think I'll actually see it, but I'm very curious what chicken protector is. Great. So you guys are totally thinking in the right direction. So let's, from here, let's move into what our pollinators are actually doing in fall and what are they actually doing in winter. And then we can make critical thinking decisions about what they might need from there. And we'll talk about that. All right. So what are our pollinators up to in fall? Well, for the most part, they're still in search of resources. They're in search of resources for ingesting, for resting, and for nesting. I mostly just like alliteration, so that's why I did that one. But all of those things are true. They're really in a state of packing on the pounds, as it were. They're in search of nutrients. They're in search of resources to acquire as they're getting ready to go into winter, where they're going to go into this state that is called diapause. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But they're basically going through this pre-diapause acquisition for everything that they need to safely and effectively overwinter, right? So it may feel easy to not worry about providing too much in the garden in fall. Like, oh, it's, it's getting cold, things are slowing down. But in reality, our pollinators are using this time to really gather everything that they need to make sure that they can survive, or that their babies can survive the coming cold temperatures, right? So they're moving about, they're gathering resins, they're gathering pollen, they're gathering nectars, they're gathering all kinds of things to wait it out, right? And then on the flip side, we have a couple of species that are looking to migrate, right? We're going to be seeing a few species moving through that are also still collecting resources. These guys are packing on the pounds again, as it were, to fuel these long journeys and to fuel themselves doing a little stopover breeding as they're migrating south to find those warmer temperatures. So again, this just feeds into the idea that in fall, we still really need to be providing those resources. We need to be providing flowers. We need to be providing the nectar and the pollen within, resins, all kinds of plant material for them, right? Providing everything that we can to fuel their journeys. So let's take a look at some of our pollinator muses and what specifically they're up to in fall, right? So our charismatic traveler, our monarch butterfly that majority of folks selected is migrating, right? This is a migratory species. This map isn't super representative of the population that we see here in Colorado. I believe this map was put together, I want to say quite a while ago. I don't want to throw a number on it because I will be wrong. But the monarchs that we're seeing moving through here, it is interesting because we will occasionally see Western populations. We will occasionally see Eastern populations just based on our situation right in the middle and our Rocky Mountains moving directly through our state there. But our monarchs that we're going to be seeing in fall are doing that nutrient packing. They're gathering as much as they can in order to make it down into Mexico and to undergo their overwintering at those particular sites. So this one is one of those migratory species that we're talking about. However, all of our other guys, all of our other species, our other pollinator muses are sticking around. They're staying here in late fall. They're staying here in winter. We do have some species that decide to go into diapause and do decide to overwinter earlier than others. So these 5 species we have here, which include our bees and our butterflies and moths, typically are going into diapause a little bit earlier than other species, particularly our flies and our beetles. So we'll see our beetles out and our flies out typically much later in the year. They're able to handle those colder temperatures a little bit longer than our bees and our butterflies are. So I see these guys as our late season sleepers, and these are our earlier nappers, right? So these guys are going to disappear a little bit earlier in the year than our beetles and our flies are going to. One more pollinator pause. And Ben, if you're there, maybe this is a good time to maybe just take a question or two,
Yeah,
see
definitely.
how
We've got
people
a
are
few questions
doing.
here. I'd say maybe we take about 5 minutes before I move on, if that sounds okay to you, Ashley.
Sure.
Sure. All right. So first question we had, this might be a tricky one to answer, but this person is wondering whether we're going to be discussing any habitat certifications today, whether that's to the Butterfly Pavilion or another organization.
Sure. I had not planned on discussing those.
No problem at
Um,
all.
but I would be happy when I share slides with Ben and Resource Central to maybe include a slide at the end that has some different opportunities. We currently don't have a habitat certification through Butterfly Pavilion right now, but we are working on it. But there are some really great options out there.
Okay. And then I've got some ideas as well about local groups that can help you certify your garden. When we're done with this Q&A break, I can list those options in the chat.
Amazing.
Next question is from someone who's noticed less pollen or fewer pollinators in their yard this year. Has
Mhm.
anyone else noticed that? Have you noticed that, Ashley? And if so, is that like part of a general trend that we're aware of?
Gratefully that I know of, it's not a part of a general trend. I mean, each population is dependent on so many different things, right? It can be totally affected by the amount of moisture we get one year. It can be totally affected by the success of individual plant species one year. There are so many different variables that can affect what you're individually seeing in your yard. So I'm sorry you're seeing less. That definitely stinks. But as far as a broad trend, things are kind of scooting along pretty well. We're actually seeing an increase in the monarch population, which is really exciting. It is a little bit too early to say that things are on the up and up, but that population is doing quite well. And yeah, no concerning general trends for this year yet.
Okay, that's really good to hear. Moving into monarchs, actually, this customer first wanted to pass along they wanted to say congrats on earning your badge of honor and
Thank you.
keeping your garden going in spite of all that opposition. But they were wondering if monarch butterflies are common enough here in Colorado
Mhm.
to the point where it's worth putting milkweed in, or if that's not really the case.
Yeah. So that's a tough question. I would say it's not about how many are currently here that makes it worth putting in the milkweed. It's about encouraging more reproduction, right? So since that milkweed is the host plant, that without the presence of it, mama's not going to be able to lay her eggs. We're not seeing very many in Colorado, right? But let's imagine that we have a steady increase of the host plant as well as forage for them, shelter for them, in ways that are connected. The likelihood of them deciding to stop and be able to breed here in Colorado is only increased if we have milkweed, right? So I would say always absolutely plant milkweed. And there's so many different species that look different if you're not a fan of the showy, which everyone looks at. So yes, milkweed I say is absolutely worth it.
Let's do maybe one more question before I move on, if that works for you, Ashley.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. We talked a little bit about like the different groups of pollinators, beetles, flies, butterflies, and moths.
Mhm.
This person was wondering if you could kind of reiterate where wasps and hornets kind of come into play there.
Okay, that's always the question, and I never have an amazing answer for this. So there are so many different species of wasps, right? I think typically the ones that people think of are the European paper wasp, the super thin waist, the long dangly legs that are really quite aggressive. However, there are so many other native wasp species that are non-aggressive that can arguably be effective pollinators. However, most of the time, the ecological role that our wasps are filling are as those predators within the system, and that is absolutely a necessary role. So I wouldn't necessarily qualify wasps as great of pollinators as the rest of the creatures that we've been talking about, but they can effectively pollinate and they are necessary within our systems.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. We've got some other questions. Some of them I hope are going to be answered as we get further into the presentation. So
Sure.
we'll keep going, and then if we have any time at the end, we'll get to those questions after.
Okay, that sounds great. And thank you all for engaging because I don't see you, I don't hear you. I'm talking to myself and hearing my dog bark in the background. So thank you very much. All right, let's keep rolling. So we talked a little bit about what our pollinators are up to in fall. They're packing in all the nutrients, acquiring all the resources that they possibly can for this reason, for being in winter. During this time, they are overwintering, right? They're pausing in place or diapausing in place. That's lame. I'm sorry. But this is quiet season for them. However, there is a lot for us to think about during this time frame if we want to support them, right? So this state of diapause is essentially a shutdown of our little creatures' systems. All of their processes slow to a point where they're not requiring any resource input because they're not having any resource output, right? Everything slows down. They don't need to eat. They don't need to move. And they're basically asleep after cold temperatures signal their bodies to do so. There's basically this biological antifreeze that moves throughout their bodies that signals that it's time for them to slow down, right? And then that diapause is broken when the conditions are quite the opposite, when things warm up, when the daytime sun is lengthened, right? So just as a signal hits them to enter diapause, it hits them to exit diapause too in the spring typically. So there's a variety of different overwintering behaviors of our pollinators. Some will utilize bark, some will utilize leaf litter, some rocks, some wood, some bunch grasses, some branches, basically suggesting that we should leave pretty much everything. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But our different creatures can overwinter in various stages. So more often than not, they're not actually overwintering as adults, but they're overwintering as pupa or as larvae. However, some species do actually overwinter as adults. Specifically, the mourning cloak here on the bottom left, you can see her emerging from some cottonwood bark. During winter time, they find nooks and crannies in trees, under bark, and they situate themselves into a place where they are relatively warm. They're hidden from wind, they're hidden from the elements, and they can enter that diapause and just kind of quietly shut down under that bark. So oftentimes people don't think about trees being a place for overwintering for insects, but that's absolutely a thing. And what's interesting with the mourning cloak and a couple of other butterfly species, if there is a sunny enough, warm enough day, they will absolutely emerge and flit about. Usually it has to be an extended period of warmer temps. But you will occasionally see them out and about, and that can be a good or a bad thing sometimes. But then we can also see to the right of our mourning cloak, we have our Colorado hairstreak. And this little white thing is an egg on its host plant, the gamble oak or the Quercus gambellii. And this particular species overwinters typically as an egg. And that just has to do with long-standing tradition, more or less, but also that this is the way that this species can guarantee reservation of resources. So as an egg, this species performs best in the cold and the elements as an egg. And there are a few other species that do that as well. So maybe a reason to not cut back, not do any pruning in the winter. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then on the right, we see a queen bumblebee. So she's been uncovered in this photo, but she is in a state of diapause underneath some mulch material, and not very deep of mulch material either, right? So bumblebees, for the most part, the adults will die off in the winter, but not the queen bee. She finds a place to overwinter, and then in spring, she is out and about looking to form her new nest and do her thing. So this is an example of a pollinator that will overwinter directly within the soil or within leaf litter or within mulch, as is this case. And then a few other approaches to overwintering. On the left, we have our two-tailed swallowtail as a chrysalis. This particular species prefers to overwinter in its pupal stage as this beautiful chrysalis here. And so they will find a spot as nice, hefty, chunky caterpillars to climb under a branch, climb under a spot that is well sheltered and warm and away from the elements. And they will pupate and they will stay in their state of diapause until spring as that chrysalis. A few other species do that as well. And then looking at our ground nesting bees and some of our stem or cavity nesting bees, a lot of these guys will overwinter directly within the ground or within stems or within cavities in wood that are long enough for them to lay their eggs, to raise their little babies, to create these cells to feed their emerging babies. You can see on the right here within this stem that we have individual cells created that each holds either an egg or a larvae. And the mama will create these individual cells. She will lay an egg. She'll fill it with some pollen, some resin potentially, and create individual cells to feed her growing babies. And something similar happens in the left image with the ground nesting bees. Mother will create individual cells in her nest underground and provide little pockets of pollen and resins and materials for her emerging babies to eat. And we'll talk a little bit more in a second about which individual species do that. And then a few more behaviors. On the left, we see a moth pupa that's within the soil. So moths generally will pupate and grow within the soil. They will dig right into the ground, pupate there, and wait it out there over winter. Flies typically do the same thing. Sometimes they will overwinter as larvae as well. But this speaks to the fact that having access to soil in the winter and not tilling and not moving things around is pretty darn important to make sure that we're not disturbing these overwintering creatures, right? In the middle, we have an aggregation of convergent lady beetles. So these guys and a couple of other beetle species will combine in mass populations under grass material, under leaves, maybe digging into the soil just a little bit, finding somewhere sheltered, but will curl up together like this to maintain body heat and keep themselves protected in this large colony in this way. So there's a few different species that have that type of behavior, and this is how they overwinter. Sometimes you'll see that happening in your homes, which I personally haven't seen, but apparently it is not terribly uncommon, but we want them to do that outdoors. We don't want that inside. And then another way that some of our creatures overwinter is again in the soil, but sometimes they will not do it as a pupa. They will not do it as an egg. They will do it as kind of a teenager. So like this blister beetle here, it tends to overwinter in this mid-stage as a larva. Like it's not a brand new little baby larva, but it's not an adult. It's in that kind of middle stage there. And quite a few beetle species will overwinter in that way. But again, in the soil. So a reason to be concerned about not moving things up too much in the winter. All right, so let's get back to our cute little pollinator muses. So all three of our bees represented, our green sweat bee, our oblique longhorn bee, and our squash bee, all will nest or will overwinter and nest within those underground systems that we were looking at earlier. Generally, our parents are going to pass away in the winter, our adults pass away, but those little cells that they've created and those little caverns that they've created for their babies facilitate the safety of them to grow and continue once temperatures are appropriate for them to emerge, right? So these guys are typically overwintering as eggs and as larvae. And then we have our clearwing moth and our woodland skipper, our two lepidopterans. So our clearwing moth is going to overwinter in a pupal stage. It's going to have its own cocoon. It's going to create that with its own bodily compounds, and it's generally going to stay that way within tree bark, within leaf litter, and oftentimes within little tangles of tree roots as well. So in these different little niches, you may find a moth cocoon, specifically a clearwing or a sphinx moth cocoon in the tree bark, leaf litter, and tree roots. And then our woodland skipper is actually going to overwinter as this tiny, newly emerged caterpillar, a caterpillar that's fresh out of the egg. It hasn't had a chance to eat anything at all. It will immediately make itself this little silk blanket, and it will attach itself to a bunch grass, to a sedge of some kind, and it will overwinter as an itty bitty little caterpillar in its own little homespun blanket. So something else to look out for in the garden in winter, a reason to not cut down those grasses, not cut down things that maybe seem soft and unnecessary. You may have something like a woodland skipper or another species utilizing it to overwinter, right? And then we have our blister beetle. These guys will overwinter in the soil. And as I said, they will overwinter as like a teenager or a pseudo pupa. It's like between the pupa and the adult. So a teenager in the soil is where you're going to find those blister beetles. And then we have our flies. So our green bottle flies, they will overwinter as a marvelous maggot or as a pupa, either or. It just kind of depends on where they're at in their life stage when temperatures get much colder. And they will do that within the soil. So another soil overwinterer. And then we have our woolly bee fly, which has a very complex and kind of gross life cycle. For overwintering, they will overwinter inside a bee's nest. They will find a ground nester or a stem nester. Mama will flick her eggs either inside the nest or next to the nest. And then as the larva hatches, it will steal the provisions that the mother bee has given for her baby bees. It'll eat the pollen, it'll eat the resins, it'll take that over. And then once it's big enough, it will also eat the baby bees. And then it will spend the rest of its winter as a pupa within that bee's home. So they parasitize our beautiful native bees, even though they're the most adorable, strange looking creature, way too cute for their own good. But actually a little bit horrific in the way that they survive. But it's all part of the system, right? It all works in tandem. The bee supports the bee fly in that way, and the bee fly then goes on to pollinate and to serve its ecological role. One more little nature break. That wasn't long enough. Okay, so let's quickly move into our actions that we can take in the garden, right? So we're now having an understanding of what our creatures are doing in fall, what they're doing in winter. So what does that directly translate to in the garden, right? In the fall, we're really looking at, more often than not, just leaving everything, right? We're leaving pretty much everything there so they can utilize it for structure, for shelter, for safety as they're overwintering, right? Creating those intentional overwintering sites for them. Fall's an amazing time to plant, to increase our native plant diversity, to increase the plants that provide directly for our pollinators. Collecting seeds is a great thing to do, watching weeds, and getting rid of our turf. So let's dive into a few of those things. So in terms of leaving leaves and debris, it can be super straightforward if you want it to be. If you want it to be a little bit more technical, it's good to be mindful of a certain depth. About 5 inches is what we recommend to have if you want invertebrates and insect pollinators to nest directly within that leaf debris. However, that leaf debris can also just work to insulate some of our ground overwinterers, right? So really any type of leaf debris can be incredibly useful. However, something to think about with that debris, we want to do our best to make sure that it's not compacted debris to where it's something that first, air can't get through, moisture can't permeate through, but also so that in the spring when things are emerging, that they're actually able to get through that litter, right? We want to make sure that it is not compacted. It has permeation throughout it, right? And along those same lines, if stuff gets a little bit too thick, it can also be a breeding ground for pathogens and for disease, fungal issues, right? If we just have a gigantic leaf pile that's a foot deep, it gets no air permeation again, right? The chance of fungal buildup is pretty huge, and that can be detrimental to overwintering pollinators. So typically we say around 5 inches of depth can be really great and really useful, right? But something a little bit less can still help insulate the ground. Something to think about, it doesn't just have to be leaves, right? It can be brush, it can be trimmings from a shrub that you just pruned, and it can also be wood. It can be logs from a cut down tree. It can be rock piles, right? Anything that just kind of provides this coverage and shelter over the ground for our insect pollinators to move in, to take refuge, and to decide to overwinter, whether as an adult or as a larva or an egg, right? And next, thinking about leaving things like our stems and structure for our pollinators. So we're looking at species that are pithy, they have hollow stems. We're looking here on the left at our solitary stem nesting bees and how they've had enough space within that pith, within that particular species to create these cells and at a long enough length for them to have multiple cells, right? So typically we say that if you're going to be leaving stems, we prefer, at least a foot. But sometimes they can occupy less than that. They can occupy more than that, right? So when thinking about leaving stems, a good length is very, very important, right? So remember here that they're seeking insulation, they're seeking stability too. So the species that can stay strong throughout the winter, can stay structural and not rot, things like that. Those are the species that are going to provide perfect overwintering habitat for our stem nesting creatures, right? But then something else to think about are our shrubs and our grasses. We talked about the moth or the skipper that overwinters on bunch grasses. We talked about the swallowtail that will affix its chrysalis to a shrub structure, to a branch. So leaving these things is really, really important for our overwintering babies as well. Those overwintering eggs, the overwintering larvae, the overwintering chrysalids, all of that. This type of structure is very, very useful for them. And then another cool activity to do in the fall is collecting seed directly from your garden, right? There's this concept of, I don't know how you'd say that, just having an ecotype. So your particular plants within your garden have your garden's ecotype, right? They are maybe native to Colorado. They're maybe native to the Front Range, but in a sense, they are native to your garden, right? And over time, they've developed associated genetics with the soil of your garden, with the amount of moisture you put into your garden, with the disturbances and impacts that are going on in your garden all the time. And so being able to collect seed directly from the space where you may want to put it back is incredibly useful. You have your own ecotype within your garden for these seeds. And so saving them is a great activity to do in the fall. And something that's great is readiness of your seed is usually pretty obvious. So for example, this Retibita up on the right-hand top here, you see the color is nice and brown. You give the tip a pinch and those seeds will give way right away. And that tends to be the case with most species. If they're ready to give up their seed, if their seed is ripe, you will touch, you will pinch, you will move. And of course, it depends on the species. They will easily give themselves up, right? Like they would in the natural environment. They would move for wind, or they would move for a passing grazer. Our seeds are usually pretty good at telling us when they're ready to be collected, but something that's really important is knowing your plant species, right? Knowing what you have in your garden, because you should not be collecting if you don't know. Do not collect weed seeds. Do not collect noxious plants, right? And this can also be a great thing to share with neighbors, a great way to get your neighbors involved in providing habitat and providing for our pollinators, right? Another great activity this time of year that's really important is watching your weeds, weeding and seeing what's going on in your space. And I will say this time of year, knowing that pollinators are really resource packing and we're seeing some species migrating through, manual control is really the way to go, right? If you can avoid spraying things, if you can avoid any type of chemical control and just go with manual control, I would say that is the way to go. And here we have 3 species that tend to be a problem a lot of times, but particularly in the fall, as they're pretty good at handling cooler temperatures. But I would say get to know what weeds are coming up in your yard, and getting rid of them earlier is great, because you're not damaging the soil. You're not really having to be concerned with those overwintering critters that we've been talking about, right? So if you can pull these out, mess with the soil earlier in the season, that's going to be better for our overwintering creatures. Okay. And another great thing that we can do in fall is use this time to get rid of our turf grass, right? It can be a great time to use this sheet mulching method. And admittedly, I am certainly not an expert on this, but there are so many resources that you can access that can walk you through this process. But generally, the idea is that you're utilizing mulch, you're utilizing some type of compost or organic material, putting that on top of a barrier of sorts directly on top of your grass or any weedy material that you're trying to smother out. And the reason it's a great time to do that in fall is that you basically get to set it and forget it until spring and then pull things up and see how they're looking, right? It's just a great time frame to take advantage of not needing to have your garden full of flowers, your garden full of available resources for pollinators in that way. But also, if you have an HOA, it can be a problem doing that kind of thing in the summertime. So it's great to take advantage of the fall and winter for this kind of thing. And then next, planting in the fall is an amazing, amazing thing to do. So if you've noticed that you're low on floral resources, you're low on structural resources for pollinators, fall is an incredible time to plant. And one of the main reasons is that they're not having to adjust to the soil, adjust to their environment at the same time as temperatures are increasing, right? They're getting to take advantage of the fall and winter moisture. They're getting to take advantage of the cool temperatures and really put their energy into the development of their roots and their energy into establishing themselves and getting comfortable throughout the fall and the winter. So I always suggest, if you have the chance to do some planting in fall, and it's going to greatly benefit your pollinators. And again, if you can time that before our creatures are overwintering in the soil, right? Okay, and here are some different species that are great late bloomers to provide some of that fall forage for our pollinators. And I apologize, I'm talking too much. We're going to quickly move through these next ones. So something that is really, really great, that will always benefit your pollinators, will always benefit the health of your garden and your space, is knowing what the heck you're looking at, right? And being able to track what's going on in your garden. So something that I really like to do is utilize iNaturalist to kind of create this database of the creatures that I'm seeing in my garden. And these QR codes on the left is for Apple, on the right is for Android. This will just take you to the app. And I do encourage you to download this. It basically allows you to take photos of what you're seeing in your space and not only identify it, but then go ahead and take a snapshot and put it into a global database of all the species that are around the world. And so you can see here, I have my personal home zoomed in on. If I was on the website, if I was on the app, you'd be able to scroll through and see all the different species that I'm seeing, but it helps me track what time of year I'm seeing what. Maybe it helps me understand I need to provide more for the swallowtail butterflies. Maybe it shows that I'm never seeing any fly species. What's going on there? How can I change that? But it is just a really amazing tool to really understand what's going on in your space and make informed decisions. So fall is a great time to be collecting that data about what you're seeing. One more pollinator pause. Look at all that pollen on those legs. All right. So now let's look at some of the things that we can be doing in winter, right? There's not a whole lot, to be honest, but really we're just looking at things that are minimally impacting our site, right? If we're doing something like pruning, it needs to be protective of our pollinators that may be utilizing it, right? If we're doing any mulching, we need to be understanding that there may be something in the soil that is nesting there. We need to be mindful of how we're doing that. Watering in winter is great. Seeding some species in winter is great. And it's also an amazing time to continue doing some wildlife data collection and seeing what's going on in your yard. But also, since it is a bit of a quiet time, really sit back, envision, and plan what you want to take place in your garden for spring. All right. So like I was saying, generally, we just want to be incredibly low impact in our space. If we're doing pruning, it should really be for safety, for health. And I know winter is a great time to do it, but it is really important that we're mindful. We're checking where we're pruning for any of those overwintering creatures, right? Are there any chrysalids? Are there any creatures utilizing this as their overwintering grounds? So it's good to think modest pruning and mindful pruning. And same with mulch, right? If we're going to be mulching in the winter, which can be a great idea to make sure we're insulating our plants, don't go too thick for a variety of reasons, but also make sure that when we're putting the mulch on, we're not also digging up the soil and disturbing any overwintering creatures in there, right? And I will also say no till at all in the winter if possible. Because we have so many creatures that we've learned are overwintering in the soil, right? And when we're tilling, we're completely destroying that system for them. We're also completely damaging the soil biome. So I'd recommend, particularly in winter, not doing any of that tilling because we're losing the capacity for those guys to emerge and to continue their life cycle the next year, right? And similarly, with our low impact moves, we want to be mindful of where we're walking in the winter as things get wet, things can get super compacted, and just be mindful of how we're compacting our garden beds. Okay, another great thing to do in winter is actually seeding, right? We can do some seeding in situ, so directly in our garden, using those species that really love being stratified. They love having that cold snap of winter, and they actually need it in order to germinate. So winter can really be a great time to do some seeding. Particularly on a warm day before a moisture event. just a time where you're able to get those seeds in good contact with the soil, and maybe lightly rake them in a little bit. But winter, a great time for seeding in situ. But then also it's a great time to maybe start some seeds that you've collected in your garden, maybe start some seeds that you've purchased from a reputable company, and start seeding on your own. You can do some winter sow bags. You can do some late winter patio gardening. There are so many different options to start your own plants and then have them ready to go to plant in spring. Since we know that it's pretty hard to get our hands on good native plants currently. They're a hot commodity, and it's great if we're able to grow our own plants ourselves and share them with other people, right? So here are some different species that provide great quote unquote winter interest, but really just those resources for our overwintering pollinators in terms of those stem structures, those pithy hollow stems, or a bunching capacity like our grasses. So heath aster, helianthus species, goldenrod, our rubus species, echinaceas, those all have really great structural stems that bees will definitely utilize. So there's some great options to have for our stem nesters. And then looking at things like little blue stem, switchgrass, for maybe our critters that are creating cocoons, creating little protective structures over themselves and affixing themselves to these grasses. Those are two really great species. And then, of course, one of the only native trees we have in Colorado, the cottonwood, that actually provides a lot of cover for a number of different pollinating species. So that's always a great one. Tough to have in your garden, I totally understand, but provides a lot of support for pollinators in winter. Okay. And then lastly, of course, we have that dreaming and planning for spring, right? It's a really good opportunity to take a step back and ID maybe where you have some missing pieces and parts, right? Where are you missing forage? Maybe you don't have a lot blooming in fall. Well, let's start planning for that. What species should you put in? Maybe you don't have a lot of structural support for anyone that's overwintering that needs structure. Well, let's plan putting that in, right? But it's also a good time to ID things that are missing, maybe aesthetically from your own perspective. Maybe you're not able to navigate your own garden, and that's a problem because you can't take care of the plants, and maybe you can't enjoy it either. Maybe it's time to plan for some expansion, or maybe you want to plan for how you're engaging with your neighbors, you're engaging with passerbys and teaching them about your space and teaching them about pollinators. Winter is a really good time to dream and to plan and to think about what you want for spring, in hopes of making your neighbors a little bit jealous. Or maybe not jealous, but looping them into the whole conversation too. That's probably a little bit better, right? But following this, there are so many different resources to continue learning, to continue being involved in this type of world. Two that are directly through Butterfly Pavilion. We have our Pollinator Gardening Bootcamp that runs every year. It will walk you through the entire process of building a pollinator garden from start to finish. And it runs in conjunction with the seasons. We start in early spring for planning, all the way through beginning of fall, to kind of get your bearings and really feel comfortable with what you're doing with pollinator gardening. There is a community science program called Urban Prairies Project, where we train folks to be knowledgeable on restoration techniques on native ecosystems, information that translates directly into caring for your own spaces and caring for wildlife in our spaces on the Front Range. And then, of course, there's more Resource Central webinars. CSU Extension has some amazing programs, and there are a number of different community science programs across this state that are doing really amazing things to support pollinators. So I definitely recommend you all looking into some of those. But we are at 7:51. I'm sorry for talking so much. Maybe we can take some questions with the little bit of time we have left. Ben, are you there?
Yes. Sorry, I'm typing out my answer for the garden certifications. I'll be ready in just a second.
Thank you for doing that.
Of course. So one of the questions I did see a lot as we were going through was
Mhm.
asking about spring garden maintenance and if there's like a rule of thumb or something that tells us it's time to get started on that.
Um, I'm probably the wrong person to ask about that. I generally leave everything forever, truthfully. So out in nature for the most part, like if our flowering forbs are coming up, they would not have anything cutting them back, pruning them back. In nature, things just kind of set and forget, right? I know that that creates kind of an aesthetic concern. So I think for the most part, we can tell people like safely, you can start pruning things, cleaning things like beginning of June. And I know that that seems pretty late for a lot of people. But in order for our pollinators here in Colorado to all have felt comfortable and warm and safe enough to actually emerge, June is kind of the answer.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can with the time we've got left.
Sure.
Um, Not sure if this one is one you can answer, but someone was asking about, how to find a balance between, keeping up the plants over winter for pollinators, and then also keeping in mind wildfire concerns. Is there like a
Mhm.
good way to kind of find a sweet spot between those two?
Sure. I mean, I would say I there's definitely no good answer for this one. It's so dependent on your location. It's dependent on what types of plants you're interested in leaving, or like juniper, for example, or certain grasses are going to have a much easier time burning. They're going to be much more of a concern. Um, but again, it just really has to be your own location, your own priorities. I do think that some plants, um, that's such a tough question, and I apologize. I just don't want to get myself into hot water when this is such a serious issue, right? I will say the city of Boulder is working with a couple of different agencies right now to really put together best practices for this kind of scenario. And I think that they're hoping to release something beginning of next year in spring that is really based in science from both the perspective of entomologists and pollinator lovers, but then also folks that are very well versed in fire science, particularly on the urban suburban interface. So I would say keep an eye out for that kind of thing. But again, I would just have to say it's site dependent and depends on your priorities.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for that.
Mhm.
Next question I had was maybe a little specific, but I think can be widely applied. This person has a tree trunk that they saved that it's currently just laying horizontal in their garden. They're wondering how they can modify that to make it a better source of shelter for pollinators.
Sure. So there's a couple of different routes you can take. One is just kind of setting and forgetting and letting it rot a little bit and provide structural coverage in a way. And then, it kind of invites beetles to start burrowing in and making their own little cavities within that then nesting bees may then occupy and overwinter and rear their young in. But you can also kind of speed up that process by drilling holes in of different diameters, of different depths. Typically, I would say you want a depth of at least like 5 inches to effectively provide enough room for those cells to be built. But yeah, you can set it, forget it, let nature try to do its thing, or you can speed up the process and drill some of those holes in there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Next one, someone's asking if we were to cut down like a bunch of grass and flower stems with a scythe and kind of leave that in a pile, would that be just as effective as leaf litter, or is there a reason you wouldn't recommend doing that?
Yeah, I mean, my mind is still stuck on that last fire concern question because it is such a big thing. So if you're in an area where fire is of a concern, I would say that that can definitely be problematic, particularly dry grasses. But in terms of pollinator cover and support for overwintering creatures, that's great. Any type of plant material that's been cut, set, and forget, they'll utilize for structure. So and for shelter.
All right. We talked a little bit about not tilling your yard, especially over
Mhm.
winter. Someone's wondering if aeration has any effect on pollinators, and whether or not you'd recommend doing that.
Yeah, so it definitely can, just in terms of if the aerating equipment directly hits a bee nest, right, or hits an overwintering critter. But again, it's kind of balancing your priorities, determining how much that aeration is going to really benefit the garden soil. If it is so compact that you're not able to grow anything, you're not supporting pollinators if you can't grow anything, right? But there is always the chance that there are some nesters. So I would say if you're going to aerate, I would check the area first for maybe some of those bee hole or bee nest entrances. So oftentimes you'll see them as kind of built up little hills of dirt around a hole. Sometimes you'll see them in aggregations where there's maybe like 10 to 15 holes pretty close to each other. So I would say best practice would be investigate your area first and see if you have any potential nesters before aerating. But if aerating will allow you to have plant material, then that's a great thing for pollinators too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm,
If we are looking to cut back anything at all this fall, is
mhm.
there a time that's like really safe to do it where we're not disturbing pollinators? Is that before it starts to get cold, right when that cold hits?
Um, I guess again, I would say there's not necessarily a designated time frame because different species are going to be nesting and preparing for overwintering all the way from now until end of October, right? So I think it's kind of just picking and choosing what you're cutting down. If there's stems that are already falling, if there's stems that are hanging over a walkway, you can prioritize those kinds of things. But then also something to think about is maybe cutting back and then leaving those stems in place in case there is somebody that's already occupying it. They do maybe have the chance of continuing to survive. So instead of shredding, instead of composting, if you have the opportunity to cut and set it and forget it and leave it there, then that's always a good option.
Okay. And then as far as like if someone has landscaping fabric in a portion of their
Mhm.
yard, is there any sense in putting like a leaf pile on top of that? Does the landscape fabric kind of mitigate any work we're doing to support pollinators?
That's tough. So the weed fabric is going to prevent anything from getting into the soil and prevent anything from getting out of the soil, right? So anything that's utilizing the soil for nesting, it's a no-go. But there is a chance that if the leaf litter is stacked enough, that someone may dip in there and use exactly that for overwintering. There is a chance that that can be useful. But if there's anything that needs the soil itself, that weed barrier is really going to prevent anything from happening there.
Okay. We have reached 8 o'clock. I have one more question, if you don't mind, Ashley, that I think would be really helpful to
Sure,
folks.
sure.
Okay. So this person mentioned that they usually incorporate chopped up leaves into their garden soil in the fall.
Mhm.
How does that work with the no-till recommendation?
That's an interesting one. I haven't thought about that one too much. Um, So maybe again, it's kind of along the same lines of that aeration. Like do some investigation. If you have a spot where you totally know that you have some ground nesting bees, there's really no point in chopping up those leaves and potentially damaging that cavernous system. But I think, if including that organic material in the soil is really going to benefit the overall health of that soil and the um, water holding capacity and oxygen movement and all of that for the health of your plants, I'd say you can try. But again, investigate first and see who may potentially be using these spaces before getting into the ground. And if you do have to till and move in, like the first few inches of the soil, I would say stick there. Don't go any deeper than that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ashley, for your presentation today and for taking the time
Yeah.
to answer all these questions.